Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Ed Cunningham. He is the Executive Director of Neurology MSLs at Synovian Pharmaceuticals. And today we discuss field medical execution despite limited resources. Awesome conversation. Ed's great. I think you guys are really going to like this. Don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn. Check us out on YouTube. And really check out our MSL Talk Live discussion, which has been moved from Clubhouse to LinkedIn Live. It's the first Tuesday of every month at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, and you'll see announcements on LinkedIn, but it's an awesome conversation. I think people are getting a lot out of it, and I invite you guys to join us. Hey, Ed, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me, my friend.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be here. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. And, we go back a long way. This was like one of those things that I was kind of hoping we would pull together, and we've been talking about it. And here we are. So you're awesome. Thank you for taking the time to do this. And why don't you do a quick intro, tell everybody, who you are, where you're from, all that good stuff.
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say great to be here with you, Tom. Like you said, we've been talking about this for a bit, and just want to say, I think what you're doing with the podcast and in general goes a long way to sharing ideas and moving our profession forward. So just wanted to thank you first and foremost.
Awesome.
So with that, just a little bit about myself. So Ed Cunningham, I am the lead for the Neurology Medical Science Liaison team at Synovian. So I've been with the company for the last 7.5 years. Born and raised in New Jersey, lived in Milwaukee, actually, where I am now for the last 9 years. I'm a PharmD by training, graduated from University of the Sciences in Philadelphia. Been in the industry now for 19 years. Started with J&J as a drug information resident, spent some time throughout other medical functions at AZI, where I spent about 10 years. And then, as I mentioned, currently working with Synovian, where I've been for the last 7.5 years.
Yeah, man, that's why I wanted to get you on here, because you have a great track record, a great background. You've seen it all, done it all, different size companies, different environments. And by the way, this was your idea. This topic was your idea. I know that there's a lot of companies out there and a lot of MSL leaders that are running teams and managing teams with very limited resources. So let's start right there. What's it like being in your chair where you're running the show, but you have limited resources?
Yeah, so again, it's near and dear to my heart, and I figured it's definitely a topic that other MSL leaders are facing, or even team members are facing as they're thinking about their territories. So just talking about my experience a little bit, here at Synovian and in prior positions, I've been in positions where we built new MSL teams and expanded existing ones in support of things like launches and new indications. I've been in MSL too at times when companies were building their MSL teams, so had big territories to cover, and everyone kind of doing their part to chip in and make sure things happen, slide decks, training, reports. So I'll say most of my experience has been with mid-sized companies that don't have really large MSL teams. So there's often been the need to run things a little bit more efficiently in the field and really kind of think carefully about how we handle our operations and our platforms. So, one thing I'll say in general is regardless of budget or people resources, but especially when those are limited, anything that we do as field leaders or MSL should always revolve around the medical strategies and be grounded in that, and ultimately think about how we can best support our patients and our providers. So that's kind of high level how I see it, but happy to dig into a few more details.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into it a little bit, because I know it's an interesting time now. We've both been in the game for a long time, and I think things have really evolved for medical affairs departments. There's a lot of resources available now that weren't available even 10, 20 years ago. So how important is it to consider outsourcing services to help support the initiatives of field medical?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the best answer to it is it depends on the individual company and your situation. So ask yourself as a leader, what are you trying to accomplish? What are the strategies and goals of your team and your organization? And I think too, companies have different philosophies on things like headcount or outsourcing. Speaking from my own experience, the companies I've worked for tended to run leaner, as I just said. We were less apt to grow large MSL teams only to risk having to cut them back later on. So in light of that, one of the approaches that we've taken and that we've implemented was a contract MSL team, which we've actually done at Synovian in the past. And to give more context, that really happened before the pandemic. So just a little more context behind it. Even now, I think there's some opportunities to do it, even though we're working more remotely or in a hybrid type environment. And I'll say, the goal should be very well defined. Are you trying to expand your reach to a new thought leader base? Are you trying to educate a new group of physicians or healthcare providers that maybe your company hasn't reached before? So kind of what I was saying before, think about the end in mind and what you're really trying to accomplish. And one of the ways you can do that is by outsourcing or having a contract team support what your core team is already doing.
Yeah, no, I got you. And that's certainly one way. And I think there's so many other things too. So I guess it depends on where a company is at in their life cycle and what needs they currently have. Are they doing KOL mapping? Are they, planning, carving out territories? What other types of services? I say outsourcing, but outsourcing is such a broad term. It could really be anything. And I think budget probably has a lot to do with that as well, right?
Exactly. So, again, organizational philosophy, speaking from my experience, headcount is often at a premium, I think, for a lot of companies, whereas there might be some flexibility in terms of budget. And some organizations view budget as being an easier hill to climb or a bridge to cross than adding more headcount to a team. And if it's okay, Tom, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about, the experience that we've had, why we decided to outsource in our situation, because it might apply to a lot of other field teams as well. So we were in a situation where our team was in neurology. We were focused on a different disease state than the company that we had just acquired with a product in a new space that basically we needed to rebuild our expertise around that product. We were focused initially on sort of the national level thought leaders, more the research side of things. And we recognized the need to expand. The product was in phase 3. We were just getting ready to be able to launch it in the next year or so. And so we wanted to have an opportunity to really get a sense for what is the broader educational need beyond just the research KOLs and the academic KOLs. Had a finite number of team members, and so we opted to go with an agency, a contract team. I'd say it's, again, not an option for everyone necessarily, but we saw the need to educate more local KOLs, general neurologists, and we knew that our team just didn't have the bandwidth to do it properly while still supporting the other disease state that we were involved with. So I think the question anyone should ask themselves if they're thinking about this approach, even with management support on the agency side, is understanding you need to make sure you hire the right folks who understand the role and the expectation if you're hiring a contract team. You need to also make sure what you're asking your MSL team and the contract team to do is crystal clear. And everyone needs to feel like the work that they're doing is meaningful, that they're partnering in support of a shared goal, and that there isn't any underlying sense of hierarchy in terms of importance of the roles or who team members are actually calling on in the field. So you really want to define it. You want to make sure you're preserving the culture as much as possible and that you minimize any confusion as to whether the contract team is doing the same thing as your MSL team, and that the roles are just clearly defined as much as possible.
Awesome. That's a great way to put it. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of people out there that would love to hear, or probably did love to hear, your philosophy and the company's philosophy on why that made sense in that scenario. So what about, let's talk about some other types of, like, I know there's a lot of virtual and alternative platforms that exist right now for whether it's sharing data or gathering insights. So what are your recommendations or experiences with those?
Yeah, so I'd say, and I was actually listening to one of your other episodes where you had my colleague JR on, and you were talking about, what are the positives, if any, that have come out of COVID for the MSL role? And I would say the emergence of these virtual platforms for field interactions is definitely one of those, and just testing the flexibility of our teams to be able to interact in different ways. So certainly that's been the case for our team. So I'd say maybe I'll take the question in two parts. I'll start with the field interaction platforms, and then we can talk a little bit more about insights. And I'll say for field interactions, at least in my experience, our team rarely used the virtual platforms before the pandemic. But these days, of course, I think for most of us, we use them on an almost daily basis. So it gives us some efficiencies as far as getting in touch with certain key folks more often, more efficiently, and without the need for travel. And it also gives us a little bit more leeway to expand the base of external stakeholders that we're calling on. So that said, and I know this was part of the discussion you had with JR and Patrina, is I don't think these tools are ever going to fully replace in-person meetings, especially in situations where you're an MSL trying to establish relationships with new thought leaders, or maybe the topic you're discussing is a little bit more complicated and it just warrants the face-to-face interaction. So that's one thing as far as platforms. As far as insights, I've seen that really as another area of evolution within the MSL teams over the last several years. I think there's a recognition that the credibility of MSLs puts them in a unique position to have those in-depth, high-quality conversations with thought leaders and really get their honest feedback on disease state, on the company's products, and then the treatment landscape. So, strategic medical insights from the field, that's really our capital. And I think the platforms that we're using, we've moved beyond those Excel spreadsheets to capture those insights and really have a more efficient way of compiling them in a way that's transparent and maybe more digestible for the organization. I'll name a few maybe, but certainly there are others that exist out there. Platforms like Viva, Kernel is another one, Tableau, just to name a few. These have really emerged from what I've seen as important tools, not only for leaders to track those insights, but also to give better visibility of those insights to other internal functions as well.
Yeah.
So I'll just say, I think there's still a long way to go, but artificial intelligence, all those other types of aspects of technology are still emerging, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah, man, there's every time I go to a medical affairs conference, there's new vendors, there's new stuff out there. Things have really evolved. There's so much available now, again, more so than what we've seen in the past. So I think it, really comes down to what your specific needs are, what the budget is, and how you're looking to move the needle. So let's talk about, because this is such an important topic now, especially with COVID, coming out of COVID, but let's talk about best practices for KOL engagement and what your philosophy is. What are some of the things that you're seeing out there that's working, especially as we try to get back into a more live scenario than virtual?
Yeah, so I think, again, it ties back to the strategy. What is your team and organization really looking to accomplish? And, we think of thought leaders, I think a lot of times as national, regional, and local as far as sphere of influence, but we've really taken a look back and thought to ourselves, what does that really mean? Are we focusing on, just the academic KOLs, the research KOLs, or is there a need also to focus on the broader, I'll call them clinical practice thought leaders, folks that are really hands-on and seeing patients and understanding what the treatment journey looks like in a particular disease state. So I think depending on the size of your organization, once you start talking clinical practice KOLs, it can get pretty broad. And you need to think about how often do you meet with these folks? Are they reachable? And I'd say, really prioritizing and making sure you as a leader and your team members have firm territory plans, just as a guide that kind of ties back to what are the strategies and what the team is looking to accomplish. I've seen teams expand KOLs, but realistically, you're not going to be able to reach 100, 200 KOLs as an MSL in one state trying to cover a broad region. So can you leverage virtual platforms to reach broader folks? And again, do you have relationships with existing folks already? Those folks you might be able to reach through virtual means, but if you're trying to establish new relationships with a new set of thought leaders, probably less likely that you'll be successful doing that virtually. I think that's where in-person meetings become key as well.
Listen, I'm an old school guy. I say this all the time on this podcast, like, and I'm a hugger. Like, I just think that in order to really develop relationships, you have to actually see the person. I think there's a lot that we can accomplish through virtual engagement. We've proven that. But I think at the end of the day, there's two things to consider. One, you're going to develop better relationships live than you are
Mhm.
virtual. And number two, if your competitors are getting out there and getting FaceTime and you're not, and it's strategic or it's become a company decision not to go back and be live, you might be behind the eight ball. I mean, do you agree with that? Am I overstating that?
I think to some extent, and again, I think especially if you're new to a space or you've got team members who've never established relationships with, KOLs in the therapeutic area they're responsible for, they will be at a disadvantage because there's that live interaction to develop that relationship. And maybe that can be done at conferences more efficiently. So if you're limiting travel, to only a few trips per quarter, or budget is limiting you to travel to only a few trips per quarter, doing that more efficiently through regional or local conferences may be the way to go as well. But I do think there's just no way of replacing the in-person component for
Yeah.
sure. I agree with you.
And staying on this topic somewhat, when we talk about companies with limited resources, a lot of times it might be smaller companies that might have smaller MSL teams, which means larger territories. So how would you recommend an MSL, an individual contributor, can maintain effectiveness handling a large territory?
Great question. So yes, again, start with the big picture. What are your team strategies in the field? And if they're not clear, have a conversation with your manager. Make sure that you're focusing on, what ties to the overall strategy and what the company's trying to accomplish. I've heard you say this before, and I've heard your guests say this before. Think of your territory as almost a small business. Who are the stakeholders you're calling on, and how would you prioritize them based on the strategies that we just talked about before? And then I'd say think about the practical aspects. So where are they located? How far are they? Can you drive there? Does that require a flight? Do you or your company have a previous relationship with them? And if it's someone you've never worked with before, again, I'd say an initial face-to-face meeting is probably the best approach. But even in that case, are you going to fly somewhere for a meeting with one person? Maybe you will if they're that important, or maybe you want to tie it to several other meetings with other stakeholders in the area. And then it's, what are you really looking to get out of the meeting? You don't want to waste their time or yours. Have a clear agenda for how you want to approach them. The other thing to keep in mind if you're thinking of a territory plan is, how often do you need to follow up with them? Is it someone you plan on visiting every quarter? And that's defined by what's the company need, but also what does the stakeholders need? How often do they expect you to come back and provide some follow-up? And if it's a stakeholder you normally wouldn't call on, does your team or company have non-personal resources you can point them to? Stuff like department websites, YouTube videos, or other platforms that can address disease state information or product information. And I would say, even if you do that, if your company has those websites or they have virtual places where folks can pull content, you probably still want to follow up and make sure the information meets their needs and that they don't have any other additional questions. So it's just thinking about it holistically, making sure you're not stretching yourself too thin in terms of travel, and that you're thinking about things as efficiently as possible.
Well, you probably just answered my next question, but I was going to, because we hear this term burnout when someone handles, they have to handle a large territory, or they have limited resources, or whatever the situation. You wear a lot of hats. I think a lot of people want to do that, but then you have to worry about, are those people getting overstressed? So is there any other tips that you have for people that maybe can help them adapt their territory to avoid burnout?
Yeah, again, I think it's making sure you are identifying the folks where you can have the biggest impact. If you find that you're calling on, 100 plus KOLs, benchmarking tells us a typical MSL team, an individual might carry anywhere from 50 KOLs to maybe 60 tops. We're not numbers driven at the company I work with, but realistically being able to meet with folks on a regular basis, once you start getting more than that particular number, it just becomes too much. So really examining on an ongoing basis and adapting your territory plan as you go along, to make sure that you're not just adding folks, but really you may need to also deprioritize some folks that you've been calling on in the past, because there just isn't the need to follow up as often or at all anymore.
Yeah. In your experience, do you see a big difference in metrics for companies that may have smaller teams or limited resources? Like how do metrics tie into this conversation?
Yeah, so again, my experience with mid-sized companies, we've generally not been metrics driven from a number standpoint.
Got you.
I think any team, if you give an MSL a number, they're high performers as a general rule, so they will meet that number one way or the other. And I think virtually that also provides some advantages for kind of meeting numbers, so to speak. I think it's really the qualitative piece that we've been focusing on. So it's things like, what types of insights are we getting, and are those leading to strategic changes, whether that be medical strategic changes or company strategic changes? Are they following through on requests in a timely fashion? So really that's been the focus more on metrics. I think if you've got really small teams and you're focused too much on the numbers, perhaps it's really not going to benefit you in the end. It's really showing the value through insights, which, as I said before, I think is really our currency as field medical professionals. So does that answer your question? Happy to elaborate on that too.
Yeah, no. That's it. Listen, I kind of just came up with that off the top of my head because
for sure.
I always talk to folks after the fact, when I'm running into people and ask them, what do you want to hear about on the podcast? It becomes, a lot of it comes down to performance and metrics. And, I want to learn about best practices and how I can do a better job in my territory. So I always migrate to that, but it is, we just did an episode last week on KPIs, and there's no standard for the most part. There's not a true standard in medical affairs. It does vary. But I think that, to your point, what you said, I think most companies are definitely more focused on quality visits, quality engagement, than they are, we need you to see this number of KOLs this many times a month or quarter or whatever it is. So I think that that's becoming more consistent.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's evolved too is, depending on the setting for the stakeholders and whatnot, there seems to be a little bit more appetite for group presentations. So like setting up a Zoom meeting or even having a live meeting and just bringing a bunch of folks together to do things a bit more efficiently. And tying it back to metrics, one of the things that we've done is at the very end of our presentations, we have a QR code that provides a link to a survey that basically addresses the question, did we advance your clinical knowledge of the topic? Would this potentially lead to changes in how you approach or think about your clinical practice in light of the content that you saw? So kind of the types of questions you might see at a medical education program, really getting some more objective feedback from the audience and allowing them to provide comments too about what they thought about the presentation. Are there more gaps in information that the company can provide and follow up on as well?
Got you. Yeah. So, last question, just to kind of round things off. I always like to kind of get people's opinion on, like, where do you see things going? Like, what does the MSL of the future look like? Curious, and not just as it relates to this topic, but in your experience in any company, where do you see things going?
We've been saying it for a while now. I really see the MSL role being of primary value to our stakeholders in the field. So the value we bring to the company and to the HCPs in the field will just continue to grow. Surveys conducted asking HCPs their opinion of MSLs and their role. It's clear that they want to interact with someone from the company who can give them good technical information that's generally unbiased. And I think the way we all approach our work in the field, we all need to get comfortable working in a hybrid environment, I think. Maybe some of us who've only known the hybrid environment to this point need to get more comfortable with in-person meetings as things evolve too. But I certainly think there's going to be a mix of in-person meetings and virtual meetings as we move forward. And I think technology is going to continue to evolve. The expectation that we provide things in a timely way. I've heard of MSL on demand. Some companies have a group of MSLs actually that address things upon request for HCPs that are calling in, or have a portal for addressing those requests in real time. So timeliness of information, the value that we bring, the platforms that we use, I think that will all continue to expand and evolve as we move forward.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely what we're seeing. I mean, I totally agree with that. And I think we're all just trying to keep up and figure out what's the best way to do this. But I will say that, to your point, you go to these conferences, and for 20 years, I've been going to these medical affairs conferences, and almost every single one, if not every other one, there would be the topic of the value of the MSL and how to communicate the value of the MSL to internal stakeholders, right? How many times have you seen that topic? But I think that we've reached a point where the role has evolved, where yes, there's still the need to communicate that value internally. But I think that, to your point, you just said it, MSLs are going to be the primary resource as viewed by external stakeholders, but I think also by internal stakeholders. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Oh, yes. And we're seeing it at our company as well. We're being called into, obviously with the appropriate partnership across other functions, but we're being called into meetings, having cross-functional discussions that I've not seen us have before with a variety of stakeholders. So certainly the value internally is being recognized.
Good time to be in MSL, man. Good time to be in medical affairs, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Looking forward to the future. There's a lot coming, I think. So yes, we got to be ready.
Let's be ready. Well, listen, man, I do appreciate you coming on, Ed. You're awesome. And let's do this again sometime. We got to keep in touch. And haven't seen you in a while. I usually run into Ed from time to time, but because of COVID, I haven't really seen you. So we'll have to get together. We'll have to plan another topic, but you are always welcome to come back, my friend.
Appreciate it, Tom. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Appreciate you. And if you got value out of this, please share it with your friends. And, we appreciate all you guys listening. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss episodes in the future, and feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.